So I really want to encourage you to interrupt me with questions. You don't have to save them to the end. So I will try and take some natural pauses in places too for us to sort of stop and make sure that we're all moving along at the right pace and give you opportunity for questions when I pause as well. So, but don't feel bad about interrupting me.
And Heather, with that, can I interrupt you right away? Because I forgot at the start of your presentation to put on record that
Okay.
with this meeting, we're going to suspend the public comment rule, and that board members that are here in a public capacity are able to ask questions as well. So Anjay will have the ability to ask questions for this presentation. If any of the board members pop in over the next hour, I will also grant them that ability to do that as well too. So
Perfect.
Thank you, Heather.
Of course. Okay. Let's see if I can get there we go. All right. So our hope from this afternoon is that you're going to walk away with an expert understanding of education funding in Vermont, that you're going to gain an understanding of the key elements of EWSD finances, and then understand the audit and financial monitoring process for the district. And we'll regroup to those when we get to the end and see how we did. So if we start with an overview of public education in Vermont, first, it's important to remember that as of today, right now, Vermont does not have a per pupil funding system for school districts. That would be what we intend to move toward in the new legislation, Act 73. That is not how it is structured today. So how does the funding work? Essentially, it's state funding, and across the state, all districts adopt budgets. Once that budget is adopted by the voters for that district, the district submits their budget to the Agency of Education, and essentially the Ed Fund pays out whatever the voters of that district have voted to approve. So whatever you can get your voters to approve is essentially what you are going to get from the Ed Fund. Does that make sense to everyone? Okay. So the way that we calculate what the Ed Fund needs to pay each district is districts come up with a calculation of what their total expenditures are going to be. We deduct from that number offsetting revenues, which include things like tuition, categorical grants that we get from the Agency of Education, and other miscellaneous local funding. When we take the expenditures less that revenue, we get our net education spending. Statewide, for FY26, net education spending is $1.99 billion. Essex Westford's portion of that is $76.57 million. So just sort of give you a sense of the scope of what the state's number is. So I said
Heather,
we
go ahead.
Sure. One thing that I've always found interesting was we do a per pupil spending, but that is not in relation to the state, but it's in relation to the school districts. And does the state set a per pupil spending limit, and then anything above that is we raise that by taxes?
So there is what is called an excess spending limit that the state does calculate. That had been put on pause when we first transitioned to Act 127, which was the change in the pupil weights. That just got brought back last year. Last year was the first year that we had that in place since I have been with the district. So I think for maybe 3-4 years, it had been on pause. If a district or a community votes to approve a budget that's beyond the excess spending threshold, they will get basically double taxed on any amount above and beyond the excess spending threshold.
Heather, to add to that point too, I was just looking at this yesterday. So I know that with the change in law that got passed last year, that currently is now July 1st, when you have like districts that are looking to do like bonds currently, that's being added into that per pupil, which is also double tax folks if they were looking to do a construction bond.
That is correct. I'm not sure I'm not sure that was intentional. It may have been a miss on the legislature's part when they brought the excess spending back. It used to be prior to the pause, you would get to carve out your debt payments so that those wouldn't throw you over excess spending. When they brought it back, it only excluded debt prior to, I forget, 20 debt prior
I think it was July 2024 is when.
Yeah, I was going to say 2024. So, so other new debt can throw you over that threshold.
Yeah, and I think that's like a weird one because if I remember correctly, Colchester just passed a bond last November, which goes into effect post that date. So I don't know how theirs is going to be taken care of, but yeah, it did really hurt folks that were trying to get a bond done in the last year or so.
Yes.
Yeah, obviously the conversation we'll have on facilities down the road, but that's definitely something we have to keep in mind with whatever we're going to do going forward. So
yes, exactly.
Thank you for that.
Yeah. So on the previous slide, I said we take our expenditures and we deduct out offsetting revenue, which includes things like tuition and categorical grants. And I'm sure you were like, what are categorical grants? So that's what we're going to talk about here on this slide. What you're seeing here is both the state number, total for the state, and then what is EWSD's number for FY25, data in millions on this. So the total special education aid that we get from the state, there's a block grant, as well as revenue that we get for state place students, extraordinary reimbursement. That totaled $265 million at the state level. We at Essex Westward get $10 million. Transportation aid. So this is the number, Andre, that you were asking me about. We get reimbursed from the state for transportation costs, transporting students to and from school. It does not include athletic transportation or co-curricular transportation. That's not included and does not get reimbursed. And it's up to 50% of our spending. However, there's a cap on that. So the total reimbursement can't go over the allotment for the year. So it's possible you could get less than your 50%, depending on how much spending happens across the state. And that spending is a 2-year look back. So for example, in fiscal year 26, we're getting reimbursed on our 24 spending. So transportation aid across the state, 25 million. We were at 0.87 million, so 870,000.
But Heather, with that being said, would it be safe to say that, when we talk about different things we can look to reduce spending in prior years, a lot of times we think of things like $1-to-$1 dollars, but with transportation aid, because it's coming in grant money, if we were to reduce there, we would not get a $1-to-$1 dollar saving because we should be losing on the grant money probably while trying to reduce transportation if that was an option we were looking at to try to cut funds. Would that be correct?
That is true. So it does have, it's an expense that has offsetting revenue for us. So And I will say that, I don't think that we've had a year where we've bumped up against the cap. So we are getting 50% reimbursement on the dollars that we spend. Whoop.
Thank you for that. Appreciate it.
Heather,
Yeah.
do we still have a relationship with the public bus service? Because at one time we were giving them a stipend, and any student that showed up with a student ID got on the bus no charge, but we were paying a stipend, so it wasn't actually free. But is that still ongoing?
My understanding is yes, that I know last year we definitely did it, and we get billed based on they track the number of students who get on with their student ID, and then we pay based on the count that is provided to us. I do know that they were reducing routes in our community. So I'm not sure what we've got left for routes this year because they were paring back on those.
Right, and that would be reimbursable by the state with a 2-year look back because it's transporting to and from school.
That is correct.
But that also transportation for the internship programs, that's also reimbursable.
Can you say more what you mean by internship programs?
Student placement for internship, the different offerings. Trying to think what comes up in my mind, but
Are you talking about placement like in businesses that we have, like maybe through CTE?
yes, I know my nephew was placed at IBM water treatment and benefited from that because now he works the Burlington. But would that transportation to that placement be reimbursable?
I don't think it is. I think we transport that using our vans, and that's a work placement program. If it's what I think you're referring to.
Yes, that exactly.
Yeah. Okay. We also have, I talked about state place students already. Sorry, I thought it was included in special ed, but I have it called out separately here. And, we're starting to get into smaller numbers here. We get technical education aid, universal school meals, flexible pathways, which we don't get any of those funds. And then there's some other small EEE funding. We don't get small schools, but that is in the state number there, the 13 million. So in total, our categorical grants for Essex Westford are 13.75 million out of a total state amount of 368 million. So as we look at the Ed Fund and look at where do they get their money from, I find this to be an interesting graph to just sort of wrap our heads around, because while the majority of it is from property taxes, there are other sources of revenue. So we've got 26% that comes from homestead property tax. And then 39% is actually coming from non-homestead property tax. Sales and use is contributing 26%. So that is another significant revenue source to the Ed Fund. So when, we have a good tourist season, those numbers can be up. When we have a bad tourist season, those numbers can be down, and that's impacting the revenue in the Ed Fund. The rest of the numbers we get a bit smaller, and the next couple are just a portion of it. So we get a third of the purchase and use tax. We get a quarter of the meals and rooms tax. You might wonder what's the difference between purchase and use and sales and use. The purchase and use is a term that the state uses specific to vehicles. So that's where those fall. And then we do get some other smaller revenue sources from lottery and Medicaid. And of course, this past year, we had that one-time general fund transfer of 25 million. So that, when that happens, while it buys down the tax rates, it is not guaranteed that we're going to have that next year. And so if we don't have that, then we're sort of starting already with a behind a little bit from revenue. So it's good, but it also can be challenging to deal with the following year.
Hey, Heather, question for you.
Yeah.
Community members ask us all the time in the last couple of years about marijuana tax, money from that. I'm assuming that's part of the sales and use tax. It's lumped in there because I think there's always this idea that, like in other states, like like Colorado and places like that, they do get a lot of money from that there. We were a smaller state, we don't have as many, so I think that people assume that it's a lot bigger portion of
I
the
think that's actually separate, and I don't think it's going toward the ed fund.
For the general fund.
I'd have to look it up. I want to say it was going toward maybe pre-K, but I want to look it up. It's not going towards the ed fund as far as I know.
Okay, that's good because I know that question's come up multiple times from community members over the last 2 years. And usually we tell them that even if it were, it's such a small amount compared to the other money and revenues that go into the ed fund that it wouldn't make much of a huge difference. So knowing that it's going mainly to pre-K, possibly go to pre-K and not going to the main ed fund will be good to know.
Yeah, don't quote me on that. So let me look it up and I can get back to you on that question.
Yeah, no worries. We can save that. And then, at a future meeting, we can share that here and at the full board so that when that question comes again, and it will come up again, we can share that with the community. So.
Okay, let me just make a note.
Heather, one thing that's always eluded me is the per pupil spending. There's that for the district, but then the state allocates monies based on student population, but it doesn't cover 100%. And what the state allocates, then that's where the property taxes come in place.
I'm not sure I understood that question, Andre. We do not get money from the state. We are not getting money on a student basis.
No longer. Okay.
No.
So then how is the property taxes determined?
We are going to look at that.
Okay.
Coming up. Stay tuned.
Thank you very much.
Of course. Any other questions about the ed fund? Okay. Okay, so here is how we calculate, Here's how we calculate taxpayer impact. We identify our expenses. We talked about that. We subtract the offsetting revenues. We talked about that. And I see Jemima's hand, so I'm going to pause.
Will you define taxpayer impact?
Yes. So this is how we get down to the tax rate. Then we take that net ed spending and we divide it by our long-term weighted average daily membership. And we're going to talk about each of these pieces. So we're going to get into them. Then we divide it by the homestead yield. That gives us our homestead tax rate. Then we use that nasty little thing called the common level of appraisal. And that gets us to our tax rate after CLA, common level of appraisal, for each town. So we're going to break this down into its pieces. So here's a look at what our budget looked like using all of those numbers for last year. We had budgeted expenditures of 94.7 million. We had those offsetting revenues, which were tuition and categorical funding of 18.1 million. That got us down to net ed spending of 76.5 million. We divided that by our long-term weighted average daily membership. And we're going to talk about what that looks like, how we get that number. And that gave us our net ed spending per long-term weighted average daily membership, 14,072. We then divide that by the property yield that's set by the state legislature. We're going to talk about what that is. And that gives us our equalized or homestead tax rate, the 1.6370. Under H850, which was not this past year, but the year before, everybody that qualified could get a cent discount. It is decreasing each year by 20%. So year one was 100%. The next year is 80% of that. And so we are in FY26 was year two. So we were at 80% of what we got. So we deduct that 10 cents and we get 1.5370. I didn't put every town in here because I was just doing it as an example. But then we divide it by our common level of appraisal, again, determined by the state. And that gets us our tax rate that's going to show up on a taxpayer's bill, $2.0229. So let's break the pieces up and look at the individual pieces. When we're talking about pupil counts, we use lots of different terms. We have average daily membership, and that is a specific term defined by the state as the number of students, resident students in the district based on a 20-day time frame. It is from the 11th day of school through the 30th day of the school year. So the dates change depending on when school starts and ends, but the 11th and the 30th days are consistent. And a student is one ADM if they were enrolled in your school for those entire 20 days. If somebody came in partway through, they weren't there at the 11th and they came partway through, and maybe they were only there for 10 days out of that time frame, they would be half of a ADM. Okay. Then we look at long-term membership. So that is the average ADM. So we go back up to that calculation for the current and the prior year. So we average the 2 years out to help, flatten out any fluctuations by taking that 2-year average. Now, enrollment is also something that we talk about, and enrollment is yet a different number. It is measured on one day out of the school year, October 1st of each school year. We capture what our total student enrollment is, and that is our enrollment number. As we've been working with the Agency of Ed, we've heard it referred to as butts in seats, which is not a great term, but it's helpful to think of it that way because what it does is it does exclude students who are attending outside placements. So if we have a student that's going to Baird School, for example, they are not part of our enrollment because they are not sitting physically in our classroom.
Half enrollment, is that counted as the butts in the seats? And I'll qualify that. We had a resident in town that homeschooled their children, and they attended Mount Mansfield, but in order for their children to take part in sports, they had to be enrolled at least half time at the high school. So is that count as a full student, or is it?
If they are, I would have to ask our data manager. If they were homeschooled 100% of the time, that is not a butt in seat.
Right. But if they are
if they are partially in, I would have to check with our data manager. I'm not sure how that gets translated. At most, it would be a partial student, but enrollment is not actually fractional. So I think they've either got to be in or out, and I don't know the answer to that question.
Okay.
Yeah, I was thinking the same thing. If they're not present in school on October 1st, then there's no way to count them as a fractional. They're either there
Right.
or not, right? Yeah.
Yeah.
But that would also exclude any kids that were home due to illness or other reasons.
Yeah.
No,
No,
it's enrolled on
Enrolled.
October 1. So
If
it's
they're
not
on
about
the-
whether they are physically present in school that day.
As
okay.
long as they're listed as as long as they're listed in enrollment and or
Yeah.
they're listed as part of the district, then they in or out that day they're counted.
Okay.
Heather, do they also track, and I know it might not go into the numbers, like how many kids live in our district area but aren't going to our schools, right? Like, so
We
there's
do.
600 more kids that
Yeah,
can't go to our
internally we do. So we have all of that data. Even if a student is enrolled outside, we will have them in our system and we will show that they are, attending Baird School or they're homeschooled. We do have all of that data on our students, but it doesn't get counted in our enrollment numbers when you're looking at the state's enrollment count.
How does it get reflected when we think about like our population changes in like, 2 years ago we had X students and 5 years from now we might we're predicted, but because some of the kids in private schools might change their mind or vice versa. So does that get taken into account with some of those?
Because the enrollment is a snapshot, it's always just October 1 who's enrolled at that point. So they would not be included. But as we compare our enrollment year to year, as students move, from attending in school to maybe homeschooling to an outside placement, that's going to be reflected in those fluctuations.
Okay, but you guys track all that.
Yes,
we know not financially necessarily, but just curious. Okay.
Yes. Because under average daily membership, it's not about butts and seats.
Mhm.
It's about who is our student. And so even if we have a student who is outside placed, that student is counted because we have to pay for that student, right? They're still, even though they're not sitting in our classroom, they're not part of our class size calculation. They are the responsibility of Essex Westford, and we're paying for them to go to a different school.
Okay, that helps. Thank you.
Yeah. It's very confusing because depending on what you're talking about will get you very different counts. Okay, so let's now talk about weighting. So we then, as we get our average daily membership, our long-term average daily membership, we then weight it. Different categories of pupils cost different amounts to educate. There is research on that, and there was a study done to come up with the weights that the state of Vermont uses. So adding weights increases the pupil count. Vermont currently puts weights based on grade, poverty, multilingual students, district sparsity, and small school enrollment. Essex Westford does not qualify for district sparsity or small school enrollment.
Is that based on the community's population?
Yes, we'll look at that in a minute. I'll bring it up on the screen and what qualifies.
And as far as the poverty, that's determined by reduced lunches, people signing up for
Free and reduced lunch. Yep.
Okay.
So in FY25 is when we shifted from an equalized pupil count methodology to the long-term weighted average daily membership. And that was, as I said, based on the study conducted by Rutgers and UVM. So these are the categories and the weights. So if you're a student who is at or below 185% of the federal poverty level, you get an added weight of 1.03. If you are an EL pupil, you get an added weight of 2.49. So those are the categories of students that are being weighted more. One thing I want to point out is most of these are additive weights. The pre-K weight is actually a reduction. So if you are one pre-K student, you actually only get counted as 0.54. And the reason for that is we don't our pre-Ks aren't a full day program. And so they get discounted, those students, when we look at our counts.
Kindergarten through grade 5, that's counted, or?
Just one. They're just one.
Oh, okay. And then when you talked about the weights, let's take grade 6 has a pupil that at or below the poverty. So that actually would become a
They're additive, so you could get both.
2
So
point.
you could be in grade 6 and 8.
Yep.
You could be at or below the federal poverty level, and you could be EL. And you're going to get each of those weights
Added to the
Yes.
nominal. Okay.
Yep.
Hey, Heather, real quick, I just want to add in
Yeah.
a piece just for the training for everybody on here. I think this is the one thing that comes up a lot in the state. People will jump to try to simplify our per pupil spending, and then we'll talk about how high it is across Vermont and across the Chittenden County districts. I think that for when board members are talking to community members, this is a great slide to kind of refer back to. That again, a lot of times what you're looking at is not that we're spending high, we're spending what is needed to educate students. We have students that are below the poverty level. We have students that are EL pupils. Chittenden County is the most diverse district in the state. All of the school districts in Chittenden County have a lot of EL students. So we need those funds to properly educate those students. So while some folks may want to simplify per pupil spending and say it's super high, it ignores these weights that are crucial to make sure those students are properly educated. So I just want to put it out there just so that as a talking point for folks to use in the future. This is why when you try to simplify it doesn't tell the whole story. And I think especially for most marginalized students, we have to tell that story because it greatly affects them if we ignore that and try to simplify the per pupil spending.
Yeah.
Sorry, Heather, just
That's okay.
just an FYI for that slide. Like I agree with Marlon that it's a great use slide, but it would be nice if you maybe added a little bit about it being additive and an example of like what that really means, right? Like, so if I did bring this up or send it to somebody, maybe it has that information on it just at a glance.
No, I don't have that in here, but I could easily come up with an example.
Yeah, it's great when you're explaining it, but yeah, if I was going to be like, here's a snapshot, like it doesn't give you the full picture without the explanation.
Also, to add kindergarten through 5, what the weighted average would be.
Yes.
Okay.
They would have no weight. So
They
that's
would
why they're
have
not on here. They do not get an added weight.
Oh, but they're counted.
They're counted,
Well,
but
they're
these are
one.
just weights. So these are only
Oh, okay.
weights.
So they only get counted as one, whereas the others
Yes.
fractional. All right, got it.
Yeah. Okay. Whoops. I have these in the wrong order. Sorry. Let me come here first. So this is the sparsity in the small schools. So you can see based on the population, it would show you what your weights are. And then small schools based on enrollment, again, it would show you what your weights are there. I don't know a ton about these because we just don't get it. So I don't have to worry about it in our calculations. So when we look at our pupils and what those numbers have been over the last few years, we've talked about this, but just to bring this back, FY25 was the first year in which, so FY24, we were collecting information and students were having to fill out family information form and tell us what their income was. Not hugely successful. FY25, the state started doing direct certification. So we were getting data from programs like Medicaid, SNAP, where the state was able to access information, income information on students from other programs. We saw our student numbers increase in the categories that got the weights, particularly the free and reduced lunch category. Then in FY26, COVID era, ERA, COVID era exemptions were lifted from Medicaid. So there were COVID things that have been put into place that allowed Medicaid enrollees not to have to re-enroll through the process. and that got lifted. And then we saw our numbers drop significantly because there was no longer that grandfather in or that ability to stay on the Medicaid rolls. And people were getting kicked off if they did not go through the re-enrollment process. So we saw that decline. If Medicaid enrollment declines because of the federal change in Medicaid, I expect we're going to see this number decline as well, because we're going to get fewer numbers through direct certification. And that would then rely on us getting people to fill out, and you can't mandate it, getting people to fill out their income information, which is really difficult to get people to do.
Hey, Heather, just thinking about that. I mean, I know you guys have tried. Is there anything that you think that we could do to help try to maybe put something out, maybe like through Jemima's newsletter, for example, for the board newsletter, like to put something out to like tell people like this is something that can be, it's not about trying to like dig into anybody's personal information, but it's trying to make sure that an accurate picture is painted so that their students, their kids can get the services that they need. And so that will help the entire community if we can have an accurate picture. You think like even something like that might help? Try at least put some more highlight on there to get people to try to fill that information so that we get accurate numbers for this year and the next year?
Yeah, I mean, my answer is like, right, and any time we can get the word out, that helps. So I don't think it hurts to have any sort of way in which we're communicating additionally around this form. I think it just has its challenges with it, right? Like people don't trust the system. They don't want to have to report their income. And we're talking about, marginalized populations that just struggle with trusting the system anyways. So I think it just has its challenges because of the nature of it.
Absolutely. Okay. Well, maybe we can talk more out offline.
Yeah,
And see
absolutely.
what we can do as a board to try to help amplify that message.
Yep.
And try to destigmatize it a little bit to hopefully get folks to say, hey, this is going to help our students, not hurt the family.
Yeah, absolutely.
So thank you for that.
So the yield, what in the world is the yield? I read this statement probably 100 times, and I have to like read it really slow to like get my head around it. So I'm going to try and just read it slow, and we can process it as I'm saying it. So the property yield is essentially what the state education fund could afford to pay per pupil if the homestead property tax rate was $1. So if we look at the FY25 number, what that tells us is that the education fund could have afforded $9,893 per pupil if they were collecting $1 tax rate. We looked at our calculation and we were at 14,000 something per pupil, right? So we know we're going to have to charge more than $1. So essentially, if our net ed spending per pupil was $9,893, it would be at $1 tax rate. Okay. Now, when the yield goes down, taxes go up because that means the ed fund can't afford as much per pupil. So we got to increase taxes in order to fund it. We get an estimate of the yield communicated to us in the December 1 letter from the tax commissioner, but the yield does not get finalized until the yield bill is passed out of the legislature. That is one of the final bills to be passed in the legislature each year. So when we are talking and communicating about our budget to our constituents, this number is always an estimate. It never gets a final number when we're talking because it isn't final until after our budget has been voted on. a problem with the calculation for sure. And it does change. It absolutely changes throughout the time period, because you may remember seeing me come back with like, I've adjusted the yield because something has happened in the House Ways and Means Committee, which is where the yield is discussed, that caused the yield to change. And so I will be adjusting it as I see the ball kind of bouncing, and we try and keep up with it as best we can. I'm going to pause for a minute because, like I said, that's a tough thing for me to wrap my head around. Are people feeling like I kind of maybe can get what you're saying? Yeah.
Yeah, I get it. Actually, I think you explained it really, really well. So I wish, and my brain is actually going in the direction of like, I wish the words were better, like for like yield. Like when you say yield, I'm like, what the hell does that mean? Like yield at the stop sign? Like, so if like, but I totally, what you're saying is like, oh yeah, it totally makes sense. I just wish there was an easier way to say it all, which obviously is the way it's written, but yeah, so it's definitely a concept that people need to understand. And I think if we're making up a calendar of these kind of things for finance, like we get an estimate and like showing that like we have this date, and then like the reality of like we don't even really know what it is until like June or whatever that date is.
Yeah, it is. It's usually like end of May or early June.
Yeah, I think visually people need to see that like on a calendar somewhere of like how we're like guessing.
So Heather, I want to go back a couple slides to when we were talking about the weighted. So K through 5, the students are counted as one, but if they're categorically ELL or poverty, then that's additive to their one. I think it might be helpful to maybe have that on that graph so folks will see that they are indeed counted, and that if they're weighted additive weight, that will get added to their count. Just a suggestion.
Yeah.
Hey, going back to the yield, I think just like Ann said, like it's a hard one, and I think it did not help that they changed the formula last year.
Totally.
It made it much harder to understand. I think as we just started kind of wrap our head around there, then you completely change what the homestead yield is, because even though the numbers you have there, I know are different than what we had in the past, because it's the new formula, not the old one. So it's hard to explain this to people, and I agree. Like try to like maybe having like some like simple like little bits just to like try to walk people through it might be helpful. But like I said before, it's hard for us. It's hard for you. It's much harder for the community to look at this and like really wrap their head around it. And especially like like Ann said too, like you said, we don't know what this number is going to be until June, and everybody's budgets have done and passed for months at that point. I think that's like the hardest thing to do is like when talking to folks like outside, and talks to parents, stuff like that. Like, well, you should know these numbers already. And I'm like, nobody knows these numbers until after budgets get passed, and they're like, that makes no sense. And I'm like, thank you, welcome to our world. Like this is what we deal with. It's like, and it's hard enough for us. I know it's probably infinitely harder for you and your team. Like this is a thing that like makes budgeting for schools around here so hard, because we're dealing with a lot of hypothetical numbers or just projections that could drastically change well after the budgets are passed.
Yeah. And I know we've talked about changing our vote date, but on the pro side of when our vote date is, we actually do get more solid information because we're a little later on in the vote. I know there's cons to it as well, but that is one of the things that benefits us is, things are fleshing out a little bit more than if we voted a month ahead of where we are. So
now with the homestead property tax rate, that's actually the house site, which is no more than 2 acres. Is that correct? And whereas the non-residential, that comes into play because that also feeds the ed fund as well.
Yeah, so that's the other piece of the pie, the non-homestead, which would be the greater than those allotted acres, and as well, it would also include non-residential.
Right. But non-residential, like second homes in front.
Exactly. Yep. Commercial properties, second homes. Yeah. Okay. All of that.
Very good.
to add to that point, Andre, just so for everybody's knowledge here, and then for board members to watch after the fact too, keep in mind too, the last part of Act 73's passing, it's not been fleshed out yet, but that they're going to look at the non-homestead, and as opposed to being a flat number like it's been in years past, they're looking at parsing out those second homes versus businesses versus apartments and versus extra farmland. So at some point, those will also get extra different tax rates, which will make even more complexity. But the hope is that it will bring a little more equity to the system, that, you know, those second homes for those that are high income families, they'll be fairly counted versus somebody's extra yardage, acreage on their farm or an apartment. So that will add more to the complexity in the years to come. So
Right. And the other portion of that is the prebate system as we know it now is going to change, where the qualifier is going to actually lower the assessment on the homestead. So that will perpetually result in a lower tax rate for the property owner. But on the other hand, I'm not sure if they're going to pick up the qualifying income or not, because since Act 60 was initiated, they've lowered the qualifying upper limit income.
that was another whole story. Like that one, they're going to have the clip is going to go away from that there, so that's going to be a good thing. But then yes, the numbers are going to be lower. Yeah, that's going to be a one in flux for another couple of years. So.
Absolutely.
Heather, I'm sorry, I have a quick question on the yield. Back to the other slide. So I understand what they can pay out if the rate was $1. Are the numbers like the 9,893? Then is that figured out? Is that number relevant to our district with our student weights, or is that like per every student in the state?
Every student in the state.
Okay, that's what I thought. I just wanted to be sure I had that right. Thank you.
Yep. You're welcome. Okay. Then we've got our common level of appraisal. And this is really a component that is supposed to ensure fairness and consistency in property taxes across the state, because values of homes, reappraisals happen at different times. So the CLA ratio was intended to compare the assessed value of a home to the actual market value and make adjustments. So if CLA was 100%, it would mean that the town's assessed values on their property tax bill for their homes is perfectly aligned with market value. In contrast, a CLA of 80% would suggest that the assessed values are about 20% below current market values. So, right, we're in the 50s in Junction and Town. So what it's saying is our assessed values on our tax bills are about 50% of what the market value is.
Ow.
Yeah. So the confusing part about the common level of appraisal is that it gets applied to the tax rate rather than actually just changing the assessed value of the home on the tax bill. I've asked the tax department this question because I'm like, that's not how my brain works. And apparently there is good reason for why it gets applied to the tax rate. But for my brain, that just makes it so confusing because it's all about trying to change the value of the home, and they get at it through increasing the tax rate rather than actually changing the value of the home. So if CLA goes down, tax rates have to go up, because what it's saying is if we charged you just the tax rate in Essex, you wouldn't be paying your fair share because you're paying it on a home that's only 50% of the market value. So we're going to up your tax rate so that you can pay your fair share. I also linked on this to the explainer video that we did last year, which says essentially what I just went over with you, but another thing that you can view or share when you're trying to talk with people about the CLA.
Hey, Heather, can I add in one thing to that
Yeah.
too? Even though it doesn't really affect anything, it does add another layer of complexity, is the new state adjustment calculation that goes on top of that and then adds to that there. I think that in the argument I know you guys have probably had with the state, and the argument that the school boards had with the state back at last year's conference. It's added more complexity. Hey, Audrey, you want to go ahead and mute yourself there? Thanks, sir. Appreciate it. It adds more complexity because, again, for a good example, Westford, they were at 62% projected last year, got reassessed. They're at 110%, but then when you have to add the state adjustment, it takes them to 153.
Yeah.
And when you ask you, what does that mean? We're like, nothing. It just basically doesn't change anything. But
Doesn't change anything.
No, and I think that then people are like, well, then why is that there? And it's like, I don't know. Like, I can't give anybody a good answer when people ask me that question of why we're doing that and why we're sharing that, because it just confuses people even more. Because when they hear that, like, oh, I'm going to have even more lower taxes. Like, no, you're not.
Yeah.
And so with the moving state average, because like this year they're saying right now, talking to the tax office, they're projecting to be around 70 from 72. So it's going to continue to drop. So if your district is dropping with it, and they're like, well, your state average is 100%, it's not, because if you go with the original system here, you're still, 70% below market value. Or 30% below market value at 70%. Like, this is a thing, like, again, I appreciate they're trying to take the stigma off of CLA, but they've added another level of complexity.
I agree.
More accessible for the community to understand this. And so I understand the community's trepidation when they talk to us about this, because they think that we're making things up, because it's hard to really.
Yeah, we lobbied very hard against that, and we did not win.
Yeah, we'll keep on fighting that fight, because it is not making anything any easier. So.
Okay, so I just want to bring us back, because we just went through all of these. So we're just going to look at this one more time. We talked about budgeted expenditures. We talked about the offsetting revenue. That gets us to the net education spending. We divide that by our weighted average daily membership. That gives us our net ed spending. We divide that by the yield. That gives us our equalized tax rate. We take the credit. We divide it by the CLA to get to our tax rate that shows up on our bills. So we've talked about each of those pieces. So that's our calculation. That's the math. So here's something that's like, again, like wrap our head around it. Your tax rate can go up even though the school district budget is flat. If we never spent a penny more one year to the next, you could have an increase in your taxes. Why would that happen? One, the student count could have gone down. Tax rates are based on spending per pupil, not your overall budget. So your student count changes, that impacts tax rate, even if you spent the same amount of money year over year. Your property values could have increased. That caused the CLA to drop, which made your taxes go up. The homestead property yield could have been lower than the previous year. The yield goes down, taxes go up. The mind-blowing one, the majority of other districts in the state could have increased their spending. And because we have a statewide system, local decisions have statewide impact. So everything could have stayed the same, but if all the districts, particularly the big districts, decide they're going to spend more and increase their budgets, we could end up with a higher tax rate just because we are in a statewide system. So that's also why it's so confusing to people, because they're like, well, why is my tax rate going up? You know, right? We cut our budget. We cut millions out of our budget, and people still have their tax rates go up. It's crazy. Okay, we have 3 minutes left. We're not going to get through this whole presentation, but I think we can get through this section. So we talked about these things before. These are what's really most in our control is what are our expenses, and then our offsetting revenue, I would say, sort of in our control. But the state factors are a lot. We've got the calculation of the weights, the homestead property yields, the common level of appraisal, the non-homestead tax rate, and the income yield. Those are all state factors. We talked a little bit about income sensitivity. So about 68% of Vermont households actually receive a property tax credit on their bill based on their income. So they're not going to pay what the actual tax rate is times their house value because they get a credit. However, if you look at these limits on household value of $400,000, when we reappraise, we are going to bump houses outside of that $400,000. So that is the downside of reappraisal. All right. So that got us through that section. We've still got the key elements of school district finances. I think we had some really rich discussions and questions. So I think that was great. But it did take us a little bit longer to get through that section. But I think it was great discussion and conversation. And I hope you're all feeling like you've just got a little bit better understanding of the tax calculation and how education funding works in Vermont. So Marlon, we can talk about what we want to do with these other two sections and whether we want to come back to them at the next meeting or not.
I think definitely I'd like to come back to them. I think
Okay.
a great primer. We'll just have two pieces so people can like digest it a little bit better. So yeah, I think we'll just put it on the agenda for the next meeting to finish up the training, and then we'll get back into budget drivers.
Okay.
We'll definitely make sure that's the case.